This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. My name's Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. The most recent book in the series is Animal Activism on and Off the Screen, which was edited by Claire Parkinson and Lara Henning. And I was flicking through my copy just this morning as I was finalising today's episode, and I was drawn to a series of chapters in the latter half of the book about the potential and limits of celebrity forms of animal and vegan activism. Now, if that's a topic of interest, and I'm sure it will be of interest to lots of listeners, I recommend asking your library to buy a copy of the book. And that could be an academic library or indeed a non-academic library. Unlike a lot of academic books, the animal politics books are actually very reasonably priced. Now, today's guest is Dr. Walter Veit. Walter's a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Reading in the UK. His work addresses the philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, and applied ethics. And he's published several books on these topics. And they include Modelling Evolution from the Cambridge University Press series Elements in the Philosophy of Biology, and What Are Zoos For?, which was co-authored with the former Knowing Animals guest, Heather Browning. Today, however, we're going to talk about Walter's 2023 Routledge book, A Philosophy for the Science of Animal Consciousness. Welcome to the podcast, Walter.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to come on.
Can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
Yeah, so initially during my PhD, I was thinking about writing on the evolution of agency. I've written about the evolution of multicellularity, and I started out in an undergrad in philosophy and economics, and I was more interested perhaps in the biology side of things. And so I tried to find a way to move into that direction via game theory and evolutionary game theory. And some of your listeners might have heard about Peter Godfrey Smith, who wrote a very influential book, Other Minds, on the octopus. And I wanted to come to Sydney because it seemed like the perfect place for philosophy of biology, where also Paul Griffiths was, who were together my supervisors. But what I've been working on so far was mostly on agency in a biological world and evolution. But of course, there were two factors that slowly shifted me towards consciousness. And the first one was, Peter Godfrey Smith was writing on consciousness and animal consciousness during this time. And I met Heather Browning, who, of course, as listeners might have seen from your episode, she's a philosopher of animal welfare science. And I realized, look, it's actually much more interesting perhaps to focus on animal consciousness and animal welfare side of things. Think about what is it like to be these animals rather than think more abstractly about agency, a topic I'm still interested in. But figuring out what it's like to be other animals just seemed much more appealing. And so I decided to write a PhD thesis on that, which then later turned into the book we're talking about today.
Now, lots of listeners might be familiar with ethological or even neurological studies of animal consciousness. And you mentioned Godfrey Smith, who, of course, has been a big name in that kind of conversation. But how exactly does a philosophy of animal consciousness differ from those kinds of studies?
Good. In a book like Other Minds by Godfrey Smith, that was targeted mostly at a general audience, not necessarily other academic philosophers, although he did include philosophical theorizing. But my motivation was, look, how can we think about this from a scientific perspective, where scientists thinking about consciousness haven't really thought much about the animal issue? We applied theories of human consciousness to other animals to speculate what their experiences might involve and whether they're conscious at all. And rather, I tried to provide a scientific framework for how we can think about the evolution of something as elusive, as subjective experience, and think about it in using the resources of various sciences to make progress on these issues. And the ultimate philosophy is a Darwinian one, rather than thinking about animals from this human-centric perspective, where we just think about it in an anthropocentric manner, applying human theories of consciousness. We look about it from a bottom-up approach. We think about, how can we think about consciousness in its most minimal form, how it might have emerged across the tree of life, giving rise to many varieties of subjective experience, where human consciousness is only a very unique, still special version of it, still interesting. But if you think about the vast range of consciousness as it has existed across history as well as now, humans are just a special case, so that we think about it much more broadly.
So I like this recentering the animal, or perhaps decentering the human in these conversations. That sounds important. But also this great diversity of kinds of consciousness. Because one of the things I really took from your book is that we sometimes think of consciousness as one thing. And you really want to push back against that idea, don't you?
That's right. I mean, look, we've already started to recognize that human minds are not all identical. With the neurodiversity movement, we now recognize, look, even with our own species, there's great diversity. So, of course, if we look beyond our own species, diversity is inevitably going to be even far greater, including within other species, right? Different dogs are going to have different experiences. Color vision might be different in different species. If you look at individuals, their emotional lives are going to be different. And that shouldn't be all that surprising, but often we treat other animals almost as if they're just reflective of perhaps the species-specific consciousness. But we want to study this diversity much more, because that's how we can make progress. And unfortunately, historically, consciousness has almost been treated as this all or nothing property that one has or lacks. And rather, I want to think about it in a kind of multidimensional way, where we can map out this diversity in nature, which of course is a very difficult task, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
So please tell us a bit more about this diversity, the different kinds of consciousness that you're exploring here, because this isn't as simple as saying, oh, well, there's human consciousness, dog consciousness, bird consciousness. There's different facets of consciousness as well, isn't there?
That's right. So one of my chapters in the book is about different dimensions of consciousness that we can identify. And now, as a PhD student, I didn't want to try to defend those dimensions too much. So I was drawing on earlier work by Jonathan Birch and Nicola Clayton, together with a postdoc at the time, I think, Alex Schnell, who wrote this paper on dimensions of animal consciousness, arguing, well, we can make more progress by identifying at least 5 dimensions: sensory experiences, evaluative experiences. Now, I'm using my term from the book because I didn't enjoy the terminology too much, so I'm going to use that here. Then we can think about a kind of experience of time, as well as how integrated experience is in any moment, right? How do all these different sensory experiences come together, your emotional lives and so forth? Do they all blend together completely? No. I mean, we don't seek sounds as colors typically, as some people do. And then, of course, a dimension of consciousness that people typically think about, a kind of rich self-awareness, what it's like to be a self. But I argued, look, if you want to think about the evolution of consciousness, it's likely that these dimensions had independent, perhaps evolutionary origins. Perhaps one of them is much more ancient. And one central argument in my book was, if we compare the plausible evolutionary origin stories, it seems that the evaluative side, hedonic experiences, things feeling good and bad, that is probably the most Darwinian basic kind of experience, because it's inherently connected to the actions animals make, the decisions they have to make, right? So some things will feel good, have a kind of impulse to be drawn towards, and other things the opposite. Right? You want to avoid injuries and so forth. And that capacity can then become much more enriched and develop into rich self-world models and so forth that can be useful to the different animals and the very different ecological lifestyles they have. I'm not saying that those 5 dimensions are the only ones, my goal really was just to say, look, at least we can identify these 5. Depending on the circumstances, we might want to have more fine-grained distinctions. But the ultimate goal is, let's move away from just treating consciousness as this one dimension and think much more about a multidimensional space.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I love this talk of the early origins of consciousness, or at least a form of consciousness. But it seems to me that consciousness presumably evolved or emerged many millions of years ago. So, how on earth can we go about studying its origins today in a scientifically robust way?
Good. So, one idea that now is converged upon, at least by several researchers on the evolution of consciousness, not only me, but also Simona Ginsberg and Eva Blanca, as well as Peter Godfrey Smith, is that consciousness plausibly arose during the Cambrian, perhaps 420 million years ago, when you saw a distinctive animal kind of lifestyle emerging, moving away from animals looking more like plants, where they were fairly sessile. Think of filter feeders, where you wouldn't see that much movement and action. But once animals started to move around more, the idea is, well, that's actually a very complex and demanding activity, right? You're no longer a subject just pushed around by environmental forces, and you try to sort of be more resistant towards them. But really, your own actions are determining more of your fate. And to make the right decisions at the right time, dealing with all these trade offs, getting sensory information to deal with that, to know what to do, that's all really difficult. And it is implausible then to think that this massive explosion, where we got this genuine animal lifestyle, it's unique. There's no other branch of life that is like that. That here, it's not at all implausible that consciousness first emerged. And then we see this rapid proliferation of diversity, new, very strange designs are explored in this animal design space. Many of them go immediately extinct almost. But after that, animals are almost settled, you might say, in a way where, yes, we develop larger brains, think of vertebrates, animals with spines, but basic arrangement, this capacity to make complex evaluative decisions, that seems to be really ancient. And reward molecules like dopamine, say, it looks like they go back to the Cambrian. So it seems like that capacity is really ancient. Now, because data about that many million years ago is, of course, sparse to get, and consciousness doesn't really fossilize, we inevitably have to deal with a lot of gaps in the empirical record. To some extent, this will always involve some speculation, but what one wants to do when dealing with the scientific question of how consciousness is evolved is try to compare these different models and theories and try to get as much evidence as possible to be able to say, look, it seems like this theory or this more general approach is the best available scientific explanation we currently have of how consciousness plausibly arose.
And can looking back at these early origins of consciousness help us understand the extent of consciousness today in the world?
Yeah. So certainly when we think that of all the dimensions of consciousness, which is plausibly the most ancient and decide, there's still disagreement. I'm not saying that my theory has now been endorsed by everyone else in the field already, but there seems to be convergence that the hedonic side, experiences that are positive and negative, have been neglected. And now, at least if we recognize the importance of that, it can help us to understand consciousness in the here and now better. How are these different dimensions of consciousness ultimately related to evaluation? You might think of strange aspects of consciousness like dreams. How could they be related to the evaluative decisions we make, right? Maybe they are kind of modeling of different behaviors, risks, and so forth, exploring different scenarios where we might engage in a kind of modeling where we can make decisions without actually having to test them out. And of course, human creativity is incredibly diverse, and many of the scenarios when dreams up will never happen. But if you think about the kind of dreams dogs perhaps have, it seems much more plausible. Yes, they're just dealing with similar cases, perhaps chasing an animal and dreaming about this. For listeners that have a dog, You might have seen your dog kick and seem to try to run in their sleep, right? So it seems very similar that something dreamlike can go on there where they're just running to some spot. And so perhaps that helps us then to contextualize, look, consciousness isn't just about this uniqueness that we might think in the human case, a very rich form of language, where we're fairly unique. Perhaps we are more intelligent than other animals, although there are some species like elephants that certainly can rival us with our memory. I mean, if you compare our experience across time, then elephants would far outrank our experience there. And so if you just think about consciousness as, oh yeah, humans are on top and animals just have impoverished versions of human consciousness, that's not true at all. In fact, in a recent paper, which should come out soon, I've made a comparison between elephant and human consciousness using my framework. And roughly, humans win in half of the cases, whereas elephants win in the other cases. And so it's this multidimensional space, really, where elephants are richer in perhaps half the cases for many of the sensory capacities. But then humans are particularly good in vision, say. Our mode of experiencing the world, we rely very heavily on our eyes. We have really good vision. But yeah, we don't really have that good memories compared to elephants who store everything really well for decades. And that's just not the same in us. And plausibly because we have these external records that we can write things down. I mean, memory just isn't as important then. And of course, if evolution has some way to rely on external things, it will do so. We no longer produce vitamin C ourselves. We need to rely on fruits for that. You might complain that your ancestors at some point, the animals, decided to do this. But yeah, it's cheaper and brains are very costly. So when we think about consciousness, we shouldn't think about it as this magical trait. No, it's a costly investment and it has to pay off for itself, right? And so we have to think about what are these unique lives different species live and what kinds of experience benefit them for these cases. Thinking very much about their different life histories. That's our central concept in my book. We want to think about the life history strategies they play in order to maximize fitness. And there's an incredible range of strategies we find in nature. I mean, if you were to compare what different species do in order to maximize this goal of reproductive output, there's an incredible diversity. Even very closely related species can often have radically different life history strategies. And even within a species, some individuals might decide to play a different game altogether. And we know this from our own species. Often there's kind of scenarios where you get mixed strategies, where if everyone decides to do the one thing, it's a good strategy to do something else. But it depends on the frequencies by which different individuals choose to play strategies, right? You can think about this just in the form of games. Or if you had to play, say, rock, paper, scissors with a group of 10 humans, you wouldn't just try to pick necessarily what everyone else does, right? You want to adjust and figure out what it is that other people are doing.
Yes, I see exactly what you mean. So help me connect the dots a little bit here. By looking at these life strategies, we can learn something about the existence and the nature of the consciousness of these animals. Is that the suggestion?
That's right. So historically, life history strategies and life history theory was mostly concerned with reproductive schedules. So either you reproduce early, you have a very short life, you try to invest almost all your resources immediately into reproduction, and some animals then immediately die after. Whereas other animals try to live a very long life, perhaps have very few individual offsprings, try to make sure they all survive, put a lot of parental investment in. We are a species like that, elephants as well. But of course, if you think more broadly about all the strategic dimensions that go into strategy implemented to maximize fitness, there's many more trade-offs among many different criteria. And so thinking more generally, trying to reconstruct what these life history strategies are of different species gives us a much better purchase on what would be useful for different species to have, right? For some species, it doesn't make sense to think, oh, they need rich memory capacities or they need to have incredible sensory capacities. think of animals perhaps that are only active during the night. Doesn't make much sense for them to have very rich color vision necessarily. They want to focus instead on being able to see well in the dark.
Yes, I see exactly what you mean. These are all kind of interesting scientific questions, and that leads me to one of the big questions I wanted to ask you, which is when my students are introduced to philosophy of science, and I do teach a bit of philosophy of science, although it's not necessarily my bread and butter in my own research, they will often say to me, so what's the relationship between these kinds of philosophical arguments and the scientific world? So I guess I could say to you, in developing this philosophy of animal consciousness, what do you want to say to scientists?
Good. Certainly, my goal is to bring different researchers together. And so far, if you think about animal behavior studies and animal consciousness research, there hasn't been much overlap. Some ethologists have speculated a little bit on consciousness, but it's not really until Donald Griffin tried to introduce cognitive ethology, which studies animals in the natural ecologies, with the natural strategies, thinking about, when we have observations of animals in the wild, we can think much better about what problems they have to solve there. Whereas in lab studies, which many went as ethical, either, of course, a lot of the studies done research animals, they present animals with highly constricted scenarios, and they're often very artificial, and they don't tell us much about what animals are capable of doing in the wild. Often they can do much more. But unfortunately, Donald Griffin's message hasn't been really taken up by that many people. And my book tried to revive it and say, look, if we start studying consciousness like all other biological phenomena as a biological complex trait that evolved, then we can start to bring together the resources from all these different sciences and help scientists to communicate with each other, to make better progress on actually investigating consciousness across the tree of life. And so I see philosophy as a kind of glue here between the sciences. You might think about two kinds of philosophy of science, and certainly one is more concerned with, well, given the experimental design for this particular purpose, trying to test a particular hypothesis, does the experimental design work well, or are there flaws in the setup? And that's a more narrow philosophy of science. We're concerned about the methodology on a narrow level, whereas here I'm more concerned about, well, given there are all these different sciences, how can we best bring the resources together? So that's more of a positive vision for philosophy of science, where rather than just criticize different scientists of how they perhaps should be doing their science better, which often can be useful, but scientists don't always react kindly to that, unfortunately. Yeah, the goal really is then to bring people together to make progress. And interdisciplinary research is actually very difficult to do. I mean, scientists in different fields have different languages. Sometimes you need people to be able to translate that. And that's one of the goals in my book, really to bring the insights of different fields together. And one central field, again, is neuroeconomics, which doesn't really get talked about that much within either animal behavior or consciousness research, but trying to find out how the brain computes reward, pleasure is incredibly important, of course, if you think this side of consciousness is this kind of core aspect of experience, the original raison d'etre that gave rise to it and explains more complex forms of subjective experience. And so I tell scientists, look, let's study consciousness like all other biological phenomena.
Let me ask a similar question, but pointing in a slightly different direction. Some of these conversations we've had have been quite technical and scientific. What would you like to see the broader animal studies world, or perhaps even the animal activist or animal advocacy world, take from this kind of work?
Good. One central problem that exists in animal advocacy is, of course, trade-offs. Because unfortunately, there's limited resources, and you can't help all the animals. And so sometimes you have to make difficult decisions of where to prioritize, right? Will you go out and advocate, say, for dogs roaming the streets or for cows in factory farmings or perhaps chicken? And now, of course, factory farming appears like the worst case of animal suffering. But even there, if you compare, say, cows to chickens, it seems like chickens have much worse life. And so there's still a question, though, of how we can make really comparisons between different species, which can be very difficult. Right? Cows have larger brains than chickens. Nevertheless, we think birds are conscious. And so perhaps we want a kind of discounting there. Where I say, well, what is a good way of making a comparison? Perhaps we just count neurons between chickens and cows, but that seems a bit, just like an arbitrary number, which seems perhaps related and perhaps a good first guess, but we want a better answer probably in the long run. And I think it's not a question we can avoid because it matters. And so sometimes we have to make unfortunate trade-offs. So one goal of that research is perhaps think about the life history, complexity of different species and help us to figure out, what is the degree of sentience in different species to make these decisions. But very centrally, I hope that the research will convince people that, look, actually, plausibly, animals like insects and crustaceans are conscious. Consciousness really goes far down in the evolutionary tree towards invertebrates. Has really ancient origins, and we shouldn't just restrict animal advocacy towards the kind of very cute animals that look more like us, but red crabs, shrimp, those are also animals we should extend our concern towards and escape the kind of anthropocentric perspective or perhaps a mammal-centric perspective, which would be just as flawed. And certainly then raise more awareness for the problems and think about, how can we bring together animal consciousness research with animal welfare research? How can we best figure out, well, what is actually good for animals? Rather than just ask, well, is this species conscious or not? Because you might think, well, even if you can say, look, maybe shrimps are conscious, but how can we actually tell what makes the life better or worse, right? How can we assess how good or bad the life is going? And that's something really important to figure out if you want to show people that shrimp farming is quite horrible and needs to be radically improved or abandoned altogether.
Now, Walter, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I suspect it was Peter Singer's Animal Liberation during my undergrad. It was on one of the modules proposed, and I was very much hooked and interested immediately.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
I think it was a small commentary for animal sentience, together with Heather Browning, on improving invertebrate welfare, I believe, thinking about, how could we improve the welfare of insects, actually, which is actually very similar to what I just said.
Actually similar to the last episode we released when we were talking to Justin Crummett. So this has been a real theme of some recent conversations we've had on Knowing Animals. If you could name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, I mentioned Peter Singer, who's obviously influential, but probably my wife, Heather Browning, was even more influential on me. I mean, originally my plan wasn't to work that much on welfare, but we started collaborating on a lot of these issues, and she has very much influenced me. Originally, I thought about welfare, for instance, more in a kind of preference satisfaction way. She turned me into a hedonist, thinking much more about the affect side of things. And her views, her arguments have influenced me quite a bit. And then that has led to a lot of publications where we've written together.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Good. Of course, depends to some extent what kind of academic you are. But for philosophers, certainly, I think what we can do is challenge a lot of mistaken assumptions about the divides between us and other animals, and question some ethical frameworks and whether they're justified if they don't pay attention to the suffering that goes beyond our own species. And for a lot of historical and ethical frameworks, well, animals don't seem to play that much of a role. Kantianism has quite a bit of a problem there. Also, virtue ethics doesn't really concern itself that much with animals. Now, there's some attempts to work in how animal interests could be valued here. But I'm more in the utilitarian camp, and certainly here the emphasis of animals is immediate, with Jeremy Bentham, of course, arguing that what matters isn't how smart or animals are, whether they have language, but what matters is whether they can suffer. And that just seems very central to me and something that needs to be emphasized. And to some extent, I almost have a kind of sad view about ethics, because many of the arguments within ethics have come forth to justify a different treatment of humans and other animals, rather than, say, promote a more ethical engagement there. Insofar as academics have an ability to bring to other humans a closer connection to other animals, I think that's something really important.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Good. I think the one thing I would change is that there shouldn't be this divide between us and other animals. So just as historically you might have thought about, oh, the only thing that matters is my family or other people in my nation, we've surpassed this with humanism. But we need to move towards sentientism and really include all animals in our moral considerations. And if we succeed at that, I think the world would become a much better place.
What are you working on next?
Yeah, I'm working on a book on shrimp mines, actually. It's becoming a bit more popular now, the topic, certainly. People a few years ago would have thought, oh, shrimp welfare, is that an important issue? But yeah, the goal will be, similarly to Peter Godfrey Smith's Other Minds book and some of the other octopus books that have come out. But you don't really have to make people fascinated with octopuses. They seem already very alien and strange. And then if you can tell them exciting anecdotes that really puts into perspective, wow, these animals are incredibly smart and seem very conscious. But with shrimps, this story seems harder to tell. And my motivation is, look, no, shrimps are actually exciting. And there's a lot of interesting studies, anecdotes, and the like, where if you think about their evolution from likewise Cambrian ancestors, it's very likely that they're conscious, perhaps not the very smallest ones, which, of course, there's incredible diversity in terms of size. But for shrimp and many other crustaceans, they have different dimensions of consciousness, and I hope to show how rich they can be. Recently, some crabs have been able actually to pass a mirror test where they've been able to remove dots on their body much better when they had access to a mirror. So it seems to have a rudimentary sense of self there. They can use a mirror to think about their own body. And this book will be aimed at the public, so I really try to show people that shrimp are amazing animals, and they help us to recontextualize how we might think about consciousness, what the very origins of consciousness might have looked like, and then perhaps that can help us to reflect on our own conscious experiences as well.
Well, that sounds absolutely fascinating, and it's a book on a topic very close to my heart. But one of the things that's always struck me about this topic is if we start to think about the suffering of these animals, there's so many of them. It paints a very bleak picture of the world and what we're doing in relation to animals.
That's right. I mean, there's the Shrimp Welfare Project, for instance, that tries to get people to donate to shrimp because they're so neglected. I mean, so much of the donations to animals go to help foster dogs or cats, but their lives are much better than animals living in an industrial farming context where we can do much more good. And they've really found ways to be incredibly effective there, where even very small donations can radically transform how these shrimps live. So one good example is what the farms do is they freeze them. That will kill them. Unfortunately, unlike humans, when we don't get access to air, we die very quickly. But for these shrimps, they stay alive for many minutes. And just like we get this air hunger, not getting air is a really terrible experience. There was an episode show on Netflix where Black Mirror, where they had this parody version of the Enterprise, and one character was able to take away the mouth of people and just kept them in the state of not getting air, but they wouldn't die. And yeah, if shrimp have an experience anything like that, even if much reduced, then that's quite a lot of suffering, which can be prevented with stunners, and they've been quite effective in bringing that about, that many farms adopt them, donating these stunners. And so yeah, I hope that we can think much more about all these small animals, which are much more significant in terms of number, even if they have a much reduced conscious experience. The sheer number will outweigh that significantly, and that's why we have to pay much more attention to the small animals.
Yes, well, I'd love to talk more about this. Maybe you could come back when that book's published and we could have another conversation on this topic. So let me just ask my final regular question, which is, how can people find out more about your work?
Sure, you can go on my website, just my name.com. I'm also on a lot of social media profiles like Blue Sky or X. I also have a podcast, although quite inactive. My last episode is probably about a year back or so on YouTube. But yeah, you can check that out. My first interview was with Dan Dennett, who unfortunately died. But maybe I'll interview people again in the future.
Well, thanks so much, Walter, for joining us for this podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on X or on Facebook, and you can find me on X, or I'm on Blue Sky, or I'm on Instagram. I'm even on LinkedIn now, but I don't post anything there. But yes, you can find me all over the place. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.